The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I am a freelance science writer. I've written for Star Wars Insider magazine, and I also run another science podcast called The Facts and the Furious about that franchise.
And I'm your other co-host. I'm James Floyd. I am a freelance writer, and I also write for Star Wars Insider magazine. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about paleontology in Star Wars, as seen by all those really cool creatures. Our guest expert today is Dr. Stuart Sumida, who is a professor of biology at Cal State University San Bernardino, specializing in vertebrate paleontology, and also a consultant on anatomy for over 70 films, programs, and video games, including Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom, Ratatouille, and How to Train Your Dragon. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Everyone get ready for probably a long episode with lots of fun critter tangents. I'm so excited.
Yeah, Stuart was with me on my Jurassic World panel at Comic-Con 2 Comic-Cons ago, and we're really excited to have him talk Star Wars with us.
Full disclosure, I am old enough to have seen the original Star Wars at the Avco Cinema Center in Westwood, California, way back in 1977.
Where did we dig up this old fossil?
Some of my students like to suggest that I knew some of the fossils personally, but that's not exactly correct. So.
That's definitely like a whole logarithmic scale off. Come on, students. Well, that's great. It's always good to know people's relationship to Star Wars. You know, some people come by it right in the theater in 1977. I was born in 82. So for me, it's an introduction starting with Return of the Jedi, really. But, you know, there's also people who got into it because the person they married was really into it and, you know, those sorts of things. We welcome all here.
Tell us, what exactly is paleontology and what does that all cover?
I love it when people ask that question first. Thank you so much for doing so. Because a lot of people construe paleontology with archaeology. Archaeology is the study of people, their artifacts, their cultures, and what they have left behind. Which is very important, of course, whereas paleontology is the study of everything else that's not people. Animals, plants, from microscopic on up to something as big as a sauropod dinosaur. And also have to mention that whenever you say, oh, paleontologist, they go, oh, you study dinosaurs, right? I'm like, some of us do. And I have lots of colleagues who study dinosaurs. And every paleontologist in the world has to know about dinosaurs, especially if they're teaching at a university, for example, because that's what people are interested in. Nonetheless, there are many paleontologists who study things that are older, including me. I study animals that lived about 50 million years before the earliest dinosaurs. There are many people who study things later, like Ice Age mammals and so on. And there are some people who don't even study animals. They study plants and pollen and petrified wood and things like that. So paleontology is a very, very, very big umbrella of a community.
Are there like little niche names for paleontologists? You know, like botany paleontologist or
yes, in fact. So for example, lots of my colleagues who study plants would call themselves paleobotanists, whereas I study fossil animals. Some people would call me a paleozoologist, but I have colleagues who, you know, zoom in even more. Like I'm a paleoherpetologist for lizards and snakes, or I'm a paleoichthyologist for fishes and so on. There's all sorts of ways of describing yourself. One of the problems for me is that my animals are so obscure that I don't have a subname for them. I study the earliest animals that got out onto the land and stayed there. Some people may have heard of the water to land transition. Well, it took about 50 million years, and I sort of dwell at the end of that.
So, Stuart, maybe tell us a little bit about how you got into this field. Was it like a childhood obsession turned career, and whether or not your love of Star Wars was interwoven with that at all?
One of the things that you hear all the time, right? As a paleontologist, I hear things like, I love paleontology because I always wanted to be a paleontologist, but then I had to get a grown-up job, right? And my parents made me get a regular job. Or I love science fiction, but then I had to get a regular job. And, you know, you've probably heard that statement, right? And then some of us reply by, well, we persisted and we continue to follow that path. Now, it doesn't mean that the path is an automatic, easy one. There's study involved, there's writing involved, there's research involved. I took a lot of biology courses because I was fascinated with animals. then I was very, very influenced by a couple of my professors when I was at the university who, helped nurture that interest and said, no, it's okay to follow that. There are options and there are things you can do if you pursue that kind of lifestyle. And I was thrilled to find out that, the kid in me that liked to go digging around and looking for bones and shells in the hills was something that I could pursue as I went through my university and graduate work.
So that kind of leads into what is biomechanics, since you're an anatomy consultant. A lot of what you do is on how bodies are put together and how they move.
Right, and how they move. Absolutely. So biomechanics is essentially the physics of how organisms move. Now, in consulting for films, we're mostly concerned with the movement and mechanics of locomotion, walking, running, and jumping, and things like that. Or, especially for creatures, jaws and biting. And it's as fascinating in terms of looking at real animal biomechanics. We see some very, very distinctive features of herbivores versus carnivores, or if they're omnivorous. Each of them has a different shape, a different way of doing things. And it's one of the things that we offer to the artists when they're designing creatures. Right? So most creatures don't just pop out of people's imagination. They're usually built out of pieces we already know.
I think the earliest credit I saw for you on IMDb was The Lion King back in '94. And I definitely remember, I think I was in high school, junior high or so at the time. No, I'm not trying to make you feel.
It's okay.
But I remember seeing like a behind the scenes featurette of the animators going to the zoo or whatever to watch lions, walk around and yawn and do those sorts of things. So knowing that there was a specialist working with them is super cool. How did that come about?
I was very, very fortunate. I have to give credit where credit's due here. One of my very, very good friends in graduate school is a gentleman named Charles Solomon. And Charles is a very well-known writer and critic and historian of animation. We became good buddies when we were in grad school. At the same time, as we sort of went our different ways with our careers, we would always stay in touch. And one day he said, hey, all those animators we used to talk to at lunch, because I used to hang out with the artists, even though I was in the biology department. He says, yeah, some of them have jobs. I'm like, oh, cool. I was at the University of Chicago at the time, and it was winter. And he said, do you want to come out and give a talk? They'd love to hear you give a talk. They need to hear about horses and wolves. It's this film called Beauty and the Beast. I'm like, sure. Herbivore, carnivore. We can do that. Boom. And this turned out to be the wolves and Philippe the horse in Beauty and the Beast. And then while I was there, I thought it was a one-off, which was great. You still get to come to California in the winter, right?
Right.
And they said, well, our next film is all animals. I'm like, oh, what's that? It says Lion King. So essentially, we're going to do Shakespeare on the African plains. And so I got to talk to him about all the different kinds of animals involved. And the snowball started to roll. And I'm very, very fortunate that it's continued to roll to this day.
I heard you on NPR's Shortwave being interviewed about Strange World, which if you haven't seen it, everyone should go see it. We may spoil some things here with this conversation, but that was one of those movies that when I was watching it, I was just in awe of how much, they got right. And there was hints for things. There's sort of this surprise reveal. And then when the credits rolled by, I saw your name and you had been on James's panel, just before that. And I was like, wait, I know the person who did this, who helped make this so interesting. Was that your most recent project?
Well, James's timing was perfect, I gotta say. Strange World is one of the most recent films that I got to work on, and it was great. The director, Don Hall, had a vision of having everything inspired by real life systems or paleontology. I could literally do an entire lecture on the creatures that inspired some of those components.
I just think it's really interesting. Some of the projects you wouldn't think would have, anatomy and paleontology insight into. It's just kind of cool to learn what does.
Well, especially when you're dealing with creatures, someone will say, so what do you know about dragon anatomy? I'm like, never dissected one, but dragons are based on, especially a lot on bats, as are many of the flying creatures in Star Wars. But I've dissected bats. I've studied them. I've studied dinosaurs. I've studied crocodilians and pterosaurs and birds and things like that. So when you have something flying, and James mentioned biomechanics, super important. When you want to make something look like it's flying correctly, you have to study how wings work in air. And that's one of the things that we teach the artists. We call it flight school, by the way. Those kinds of things are not because I'm going to tell you how a dragon should look. Rather, my job and their job, the animators and the visual effects artists' jobs, are to make you so comfortable with the fact that that creature looks like it belongs in that universe that you don't even think of it as a cartoon or a visual effect. You just think of it as that belongs. It's part of the story. If we've done our job well enough that you do that, that means you've got the suspension of disbelief and we've done our job.
Talking about flying, in the most recent season of The Mandalorian, there's this giant, basically pterodactyl raptor thing that makes off with one of the Mandalorian kids. It's described as reptavian, which basically means it's a flying reptile. What do you think of that?
So again, when you talk about something like maybe I'm going to model the way a bird flies or the way a bat flies, then you have to be very, very careful. But at least when it comes to the look of a creature like that, I don't worry that much about it. The one of the things that's very, very difficult to get right is the way the wing actually moves when it flies. Lots of things, they just look like popsicle sticks. But at least with that character, what they did correctly is that when the wings pushed down, the arms were extended as they should be. But when they pulled their wings back up, what we call the recovery phase, that bent at the wrist and elbow as they should. Sometimes people don't get that right. So that was nicely done, I thought. Now, it is a huge animal. Could an animal that big fly? Really? Well, there's all sorts of arguments, right? Well, maybe the density of the atmosphere is different and so on and so on and so on. Now, in terms of paleontology, there were animals that big or bigger that flew, like Quetzalcoatlus is a fossil pterosaur that we know that was enormous. It was as big as a giraffe. And they flew. Now, the only thing, and this is probably a directorial or artistic issue, is that one of the things you'll notice about that character is that it goes about the same speed across the screen at all times. And sometimes it's flapping its wings and sometimes it's not. And most of the time, if you're gliding, you'll slowly lose some altitude. But those are sort of niggly flight mechanics kinds of things. People have asked me about that character before, and the answer I often give that they don't expect is, well, what about the babies? Now, one of the things that we do know about babies is babies have big heads and big eyes and short faces. That's what makes babies cute. Even baby creatures in Star Wars. And son of a gun, they actually did do that right. In animation, we call that the cutification factors or the Hello Kitty effect, right? Those creatures did look like baby birds for what it's worth. Now, one of the things that does happen with creatures is we frequently give them long tails. Most flying things don't have a long tail. Maybe the earliest dinosaurs that started jumping out of trees, but birds and bats use tail rudders to help them steer. It's really difficult to steer with only wings. It really helps to have a tail, but tails look cool. So, and if that's what the artistic design is, fair enough.
Yeah. Since we're talking about these raptors, I just have to know if you all think, because they take the babies in, right? And they're like, oh, here's some new foundlings. And then I swear a couple of episodes later, they are roasting and eating them. Did anybody else catch that in the episode?
Well,
I did not notice that.
Okay.
I'm going to feel very bad if that's true.
Youngsters are usually more tender. I mean,
No.
when you're eating KFC and you know that little piece of grizzle that falls off the end of the bone, that's because it's a youngster whose bones haven't developed all the way, because youngsters are more tender.
Well, so if anyone's going back, I think it was a couple episodes later. I think it was when Bo-Katan comes back to challenge, the Mandalorian camp or whatever for the Darksaber or something like that. Like in the background, there's these huge spits roasting because we never see these new foundlings again. So I was like, no.
We've also worried about things being eaten in a variety of other Star Wars films.
Right. And I do love the Ewoks, even though they were apparently going to cook Han Solo. So, you got to forgive people, I guess, for what they eat. I am not a vegetarian myself. Oh. As much as I am outraged by, the roasting of Kowakian monkey lizards or whatever in The Mandalorian,
You would totally eat one. So we have also the eat Mandalorians besides the raptor thing. There's that giant turtle dinosaur alligator thing that appears also on the same planet that attacks the Mandos on the beach. What do you think inspired that?
As I said before, creatures are frequently created out of parts that we already know. So that animal looks like an aquatic reptile. It actually has locomotion not wildly different from a big gator. And people often say, well, it's like a dinosaur. Well, alligators and crocs are the last surviving members of what we call the Archosauria, which included dinosaurs. Good on them, actually, for using that as a model or an idea. Now, of course, its body armor and so on are very, very different. One of the things that is an issue, and this is frequently an artistic decision, is that most exotic creatures, not all, but most exotic creatures are huge. And it's really hard to get a huge creature moving really, really quickly. I remember actually having an ultra nerdy discussion with someone about the turning radius of an Imperial destroyer. Well, it's so big but the answer is it depends on how fast it's going, right? So the same thing happens with animals. This is why bullfighting works, okay? Because the bigger the animal, the harder it is to turn on a dime. So one of the things that you have to be careful with these huge, huge creatures is that are they moving so fast in such a coordinated manner that a big animal couldn't really do that? Now, being in the water, it helps if you're big. The largest animals on the planet live in the water because it helps support some body weight. But that animal's clearly evolved from a land-dwelling reptilian like a thing, but now hangs out in the water like a croc. I'm fine with the way they piece things together, as long as you sew them together at a logical spot so that they can move well. And it moved quite fine. But the biggest issue I have for these gigantic animals that you might notice frequently live on desert planets, what are they eating? Mandalorians, apparently, and I'm sure that armor is not digestible. For all I know, that there's tons of fish in those waters. But especially when you see these enormous animals out on the land, I've spoken to colleagues, it's easier to film, and there's less work to do when you build a desert planet than a jungle planet. But when you're on a desert planet, what are they eating? And most gigantic animals don't eat other animals. Most gigantic animals eat plants.
Right.
Now, it's not as scary to have a plant eater because then they don't attack you. Never forget, as a future paleontologist, looking at the sands of Tatooine and like there's this big dinosaur skeleton laid out. I'm like, what did it eat?
That is our question frequently about the megafauna is what is it eating? That's where our brains go. And
it's not like you're trying to do a film in our world, in our universe.
Right.
So maybe some of the laws don't apply, but it's a fun question to ask because one of the things we love to do is we wonder what that universe is like. We compare Tatooine to deserts. We compare Hoth to Arctic and Antarctic environments and so on and so forth. And so the question is, if we are analogizing those things to things we know and in our brains we're having fun with, what we do know in real life, how could we pull that off? That's one of the problems that the Jurassic films run into. They do want those things to live in our world. And so that is a different kind of a challenge. At least in Star Wars, they're living in a different universe.
Well, my question about the alligator, whatever, I'm glad you covered it because I was thinking about that as like ambush predator, okay, sure. I've seen plenty of videos where like an alligator comes out of the water and you definitely didn't know it was there and it, grabs a gazelle or whatever. But something this big and like if there's that many Mandalorians and they don't have like a perimeter set up or some sort of like buoy to like know it's coming, I'm like, it's kind of on you guys. But I always am going to side with the animals. This big thing just wants a snack and you don't belong here and whatever. But now that I'm looking at pictures of it again, that armor on top of it, I'm curious why something like that would be beneficial to it. Because, alligators have thick skin, but it's not armor the way that like a turtle or the way that these are like plated.
That's a great point. Okay, now there's lots of armored things out there like dinosaurs and so on. There's an entire group of dinosaurs that we call the Thyreophorans that are known for their armor and their spikes and their plates, like stegosaurs. Some have literal armor on them, like ankylosaurs. But interesting that you mentioned that. And so anybody who's got a now illegal alligator pair of boots or bag, right? Only from farms now. It looks like gator skin is thin. Now, most of that gator skin that you see in boots and bags is from very young animals from a very particular part of the body. Across the top of the body of many kinds of gators and crocs, they have embedded in their skin something called osteoderms. Osteo means bone and derm means skin. These are literally free-floating bones stuck in the skin. Okay? And so if you were to run your hand along the belly of a gator, if it would let you, Okay.
Get you done.
It'd be fairly smooth, and you would see the texture that you're probably familiar with. But if you were to run your hand across the top of that animal, you could literally almost cut yourself because of all those bony inclusions. They do a couple of things. One, they protect the body, especially if the animals are going to get into conflicts with other ones, and it does happen. But also, they're lined up in rows. And so they actually do a really good job of directing water flow. They're hydrodynamically very, very well placed for when the animal is swimming. They're pretty tough. If I were in conflict with one of those animals, there's nothing much I could do with the top of them. You'd have to deal with the underside.
So are those bones actually exposed to the air, or is there skin over
They're
them
covered
still?
with skin, but it's very, very tightly covered. For instance, our skin on our faces and body moves up and down, okay? Their skin is very tightly applied to it. There's no movement between them.
So for this animal, instead of those sort of ridges and stuff like that, it really is more plates that kind of look more like a turtle shell or...
Yeah, turtles, of course, have armor. Turtles are like the weirdest animals ever. They scare me when I have to try and explain them.
Yeah, its stomach, though, does look like it's the soft belly of like a gator. So I'm curious if that implies that, maybe when they're younger, they're predated by these big flying things. Like, are they vulnerable from attacks from above rather than below? Is that kind of
I wish you were in my biology and ecology classes, because one of the things that we tell our students is that babies are not always just mini adults. Sometimes they look like that, and birds are very quickly turned into adults. But in other animals, and especially water-dwelling animals, the younger stages will often live in a very, very different environment and ecology than the adults will. This is why baby turtles get picked off really, really easily, and you're lucky to survive to becoming an adult. Many fishes do this too. They live in an utterly different environment than the adults. It means that they're maybe being protected, but they're also subject to different kinds of challenges than are the adults. One of the things that we see in film and universes like the Star Wars universe is that we get these glimpses, right? One of the great things about the foundlings is that we get to see babies and adults. So immediately the biologist in me is like, what's the natural history of this creature? We don't always get that with other creatures. We get snapshots of them as adults for the most part. In biology, we like to say that organisms don't evolve. Ontogenies evolve. And an ontogeny is your life cycle from conception to death. It means everything's important, not just being an adult. I'm always fascinated by the transition from baby to adult. That's why as a paleontologist, I'm interested in the transition from water to land. When you adapt and change to different things, that is fascinating to me. And so whenever I watch something like Star Wars or anything where there's my son calls it world building, but in Star Wars, we have to call it universe building, right? I'm fascinated by what would be the biology of that creature. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's a book to be written in our copious spare time, right?
Well, maybe it evolved from more turtley creatures, and then it kind of became sort of the alligator role in the ecology. I mean, we have, like alligator-headed turtles, I think, right?
Yeah, they're snapping turtles are essentially that. Yeah, and so the way jaws work and the way swimming and locomotion works all has to do with where you live in the ecology of your universe. And one of the things I did like about that character is it wasn't just a big animal that they dumped in the water. It's an animal that lived in the water, and they made sure they designed it so it looked like it lived in the water.
Right. Yeah. Well, Stuart, if you haven't already seen it, the Wildlife of Star Wars book is great fun. It is a field guide essentially, but it's a bit out of date. It came out with episode 1, so there's lots of Naboo and things like that on it. We interviewed one of the artists who is a zoologist. Who, there are some of those things where it talks about life cycle and those sorts of things. So if you're a natural history nut, clearly.
What I want is, instead of like the Mandalorian or Ahsoka or whatever, I want a whole mini series just on their life cycle.
Yeah.
We're working on that nature documentary series.
Exactly. I made a series of short nature documentaries. I'll send you a link to those. But also, when they first announced that Ranger series, Rangers of the New Republic or whatever, that's since been canceled, I really thought it was Park Rangers. Horror film, I wanted it to be park rangers, and I was like, oh, it's like law enforcement. Never mind, I don't care.
I want a whole miniseries just on banthas alone, So
Yeah.
There is a lot to talk about banthas. That's one of the things every time we talk about creatures and or deserts that
Right.
banthas come up, because why are they so hairy? Anyway, going back to Mandalorian things, near the end of this season, we saw a glimpse of the mythosaur that lives in the living waters on Mandalore. And obviously we know what the mythosaur skull looks like from the emblem that we see the Mandalorians have. Can you extrapolate from what we've seen to tell us more about this creature?
Well, it looks like it's based on a reptile of some kind. And the mere fact that you would call it mythosaur, saur means reptile or lizard. Fair enough. There are a number of different extinct groups of aquatic reptiles out there. Mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs. Now, interestingly enough, lots of aquatic reptiles do have that it has a sort of a triangular pointy snout, sort of snaggly teeth, right? Things that live in the water do that. We call it a fish trap mouth, because if you're trying to grab a fish and you bite at it, either you trap it or you impale it. And so when we see those snaggly teeth, it's not just to make them look mean. There's actually a reason for that. And lots of those extinct aquatic reptiles, not dinosaurs, but lived at the same time as dinosaurs, do sort of have a head shaped like that. If I could see how long its neck is, I could make some guesses, but it looks like he's something like the equivalent of what we would call a plesiosaur or a pliosaur, but I can't tell because I can't see how long its neck or tail are.
Yeah, I'm really curious also to see number of legs, I guess, or appendages, and sort of type. Are they going to be like paddles, or are they going to be, claws?
If it lives in the water exclusively, most people would suggest they're going to be paddle-like. But I can tell you there's a group of aquatic reptiles, an extinct group called nothosaurs, that do have hands and, they have digits. Not all aquatic reptiles went totally paddle. Some sort of had short limbs that they could move, but you can still see individual digits. Whereas some went full-on paddle with extra digits and extra segments. Those are the classic ones being ichthyosaurs.
Like marine iguanas, that they're a little more just webbed.
They are animals that do fine in the water and on the land.
Right.
So there are animals, just like otters can live on both. So
exactly.
There's all sorts of opportunity, but that thing did look like it was living pretty deep down.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it being the mythosaur, right? I mean, Mandalore is obviously not in tip-top shape, so, animals were affected too. But the fact that it's called a mythosaur and hadn't been seen for however long gives the impression that, it was never just flying around or walking around or whatever. It's probably always in this deep waters.
Also, it has those kind of long horns along the side of its face, especially when you look at the skull. How would that play into defending itself or chasing down prey? Or
you're leading me to one of my favorite concerns. Okay. Now, in terrestrial animals, we know for sure that a lot of those kinds of things can be defensive, or used for fighting and so on and so forth. But when you put all sorts of weird stuff on your face, it seems like it might get in the way for certain things, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the thing, and we see this with dinosaurs a lot, like ceratopsian dinosaurs, the frill-necked dinosaurs, Triceratops and its relatives. There's lots of really weird ones out there. Why would you do that? And they say, oh, well, it's to protect yourself when you're fighting. But if you look closely, a lot of those things aren't that hard. They're sort of spongy. A lot of them aren't even solid. So why would you do that? Many biologists have sort of landed on the answer, and it's to show off, to get dates. Okay, essentially, if you are weird looking, everybody knows who you are, and if you see something in the distance that's that same shape, you have a 1 in 2 chance of mating with it, unless you're a worm, in which case you might have a 1 in 1 chance. What we refer to as species recognition. If you can tell what something is way far away or deep down in the dark, where vision is difficult, if you've got a really weird distinctive shape that you can't mistake for anything else, that might tell you that's another mythosaur. Now, and as I said, you're leading me down a path that has always concerned me. Living animals aren't individuals. Living animals are part of populations. Okay, there can't be just one. Right. There's got to be some. Okay, any ecologist will tell you that large animals, to survive as a population, you probably need between 200 and 1,000 individuals. That's why we worry about things like lions and cheetahs and so on, because once they dip below those numbers, they're in danger.
Right.
Same thing would happen with mythosaur. You need a bunch of them, otherwise they won't survive past the lifespan of that one individual. Now, it could be hundreds of years, but once that one is gone, it's gone.
I was thinking about the mythosaur. Is that, James, maybe you'll remember this better. Is that what's in the holiday special? Like that animated Boba Fett riding a
I don't think that's a mythosaur.
brontosaurus?
That's on a different planet.
What I remember.
I think the planet's name is Pano, maybe.
Okay.
But now I'm curious about the mythosaur. Is like it's living in the dark, because it's living in water that's underground.
Yeah.
Do you think it has echolocation? And maybe those horn things could relate to, you're saying it's species differentiation. So I echolocated something with big horns. Maybe it's another mythosaur.
Okay, so echolocation is a very, very interesting way of thinking about things. And lots of things that live in the water do so, but things that live in the air too, like bats and so on. Echolocation at its simplest is sending sound waves out, regardless of frequency, and seeing what bounces back to you. Now, a distinctive shape bouncing back to you, that might tell you something. One of the things that's very, very interesting is that a variety of animals are sensitive not only to sound, but other kinds of vibration. Mm-hmm. So, for example, fishes are very, very sensitive to waterborne waves. This is one of the reasons that they school so well, because they can feel where each other are. They actually have organs called lateral line organs that help them feel water pressure of things near them. Also, electricity, electric eels and all those kinds of animals that have the ability to set up an electrical field around them. Yes, it's defensive, but mostly it's for navigating around in really ugly, dirty, muddy water or dark water where you can't see where you're going. So I would love to see a mythosaur with electrical senses. Lots of animals have electrical senses. And when you have weird stuff sticking off of your head, it distorts the field. It's not just a nice smooth field. So maybe it's echolocation or vibrational sensitivity, but maybe also it could be electrical sensation. And many, many animals have electrical sensors on their heads. Sharks are the classic example.
Oh, this could explain maybe why they might be more attracted to a Mandalorian falling in the water, because you'd be like, hey, there's a battery there.
Yep. Sharks frequently bite metal boats because it screws up their electrical senses. The little pores in their snouts it's one of the great anatomical words in the world. It's called the ampulla of Lorenzini. These are little pores that help them detect electrical fields. That's why a shark can bite you in the dark. It doesn't need to see you. But when you have a boat that conducts electricity in salt water and changes the electrical fields around it, that's why they often bite boats and bite shark cages. So yeah, if a Mandalorian who's got armor on that's metal and drops in the water and that changes the metal changes the electrical field around it, I might be a little uptight too.
Yeah.
Interesting. So they're basically wearing big bells around them saying, check me out, check me out.
Yeah. Better to be in a wetsuit, but I don't think we're going to ever see a Mandalorian in a wetsuit. Not cool.
Oh, I was just thinking of Jason Statham in the Meg movies, because he's wearing a wetsuit, but his personality is so electrifying.
But I mean, that is kind of what it is, right? It's the human body has an electric, right? Like, don't our hearts produce a field that the sharks can pick up?
All living organisms
it doesn't have to be
have an electrical field of some kind that they generate, and it's more easily detectable in water and even more easily detectable in salt water.
Yeah, so it doesn't help.
If that water underneath Mandalore is a little dirty and has got a lot of dissolved gunk in it, I would say that is a most excellent place to have electrical field sensing capabilities.
Very cool. I like it.
Of course, they didn't ask me, but that would be my suggestion.
No, exactly. And I do feel like they gave us just enough of a hint. And then hopefully they're like, okay, for season 4, we really got to figure out what this thing looks like a little bit more or something like that.
If we want to jump back to the Ahsoka, you mentioned wolves and horses for Beauty and the Beast. That creature in Ahsoka is basically a wolf horse thing.
It is indeed. So here's the thing that I tell my students at the university, and it is one of the single most popular presentations I give when I go to film studios. And it's called You Are What You Eat, especially mammals and dinosaurs. What you eat has a tremendous impact on everything about your body. Meat is easy to digest. Plants are hard because they're covered with roughage, cell walls, essentially. And that's why it's good for you, too. It scrapes you clean. But to get through to that stuff, you got to process it and eat a ton of it. That's why the biggest animals are plant eaters. They're easy to get, but you have to eat a lot. There's tons of consequences. Carnivores' eyes face forward. Herbivores' eyes face to the side, because carnivores have to catch their food that's running away. Carnivores, because meat is easy to digest, have short digestive tracts. Whereas herbivores like horses and cows have huge digestive tracts. That's why they're shaped like a barrel. That's why you can ride a horse, because its backbone is so stiff because it's there to hold up all those guts. But if you're a cat or a dog or a carnivore of any kind, a lion, a hyena, a cheetah, you have a short digestive tract. So when you run, you can bend your body. Okay?
Whoa.
You can bend your body, and that means it's really hard to ride a carnivore. It'd be a really bumpy ride.
Right.
So one of the things that we see in real life is if you want to ride an animal, it's almost always a horse, but it's almost always an herbivore, right?
Mm.
You would never try to ride a lion or a tiger or a bear. Well, one, they'd bite you. But two, once they got moving, the bending back would just fling you up and down. Okay?
Right.
And so one of the things that we see when eyes face forward, much easier to put on film because you can get facial expression out of eyes that are two eyes on the screen as opposed to one or the other. Going back to Beauty and the Beast, whenever Philippe the horse did something, he would turn his head so you could see his eye. Okay. Now, the problem is of course, carnivores are sexy and flying things are sexy. Interesting thing about flying things, they have to have a stiff body because they have to have something against which the wings can work. They usually they'd be too light to carry someone. But if you're on the land, it looks cool to be on a carnivore, but usually what happens is they don't bend their backs the way a carnivore really would. So what you wind up having is you have a carnivore whose backbone doesn't move the way your cat or your dog or your lion or your cheetah or your wolf would run. That was the fundamental difference between the horses and wolves in Beauty and the Beast in almost every film I've ever worked on. And so there's a couple tricks. You can pan way back so you don't see them bouncing up and down too much, okay?
Right.
Or you can change the way their backbone moves. And the other thing that's very, very interesting about herbivores and carnivores is that most herbivores have a very particular footfall sequence, which we call a rotary gallop, where you go right hind, left front, repeat.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas herbivores go right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. So you can sort of play with that. You can give them a rotary footfall sequence. They still look sort of like a carnivore, even though you're keeping their back a little stiff. The other thing that we see that's different is the way their heads move. Watch a cheetah run. Its head doesn't move. It's like it's on a rail. But horses do what we call digging. When they move really, really fast, and then they start to smooth out. You can play with those behaviors as well, and you can make it look like a carnivore, like it's tracking its prey, even if it's got a stiff back like a horse. So the answer is, are they wrong? No, they've created a creature that's based on a variety of things, but to make it look right for someone to ride, there's a bunch of tricks that you can use to make it look like it's a natural animal to ride.
Right. Okay.
Interestingly, you want to be very careful where the center of that animal's mass is. Okay? If you've ever ridden a horse, horses have big heads and necks, so you ride right behind their shoulders. You don't ride in the middle of their back. You ride right behind their shoulders. Same with an elephant or a bantha, right? Their center of mass is over their shoulders, so that's where you ride for the most part. If you have an animal with a smaller head, the center of mass moves back, and that's where you want your rider to be.
Right.
So those are all little variables that we can play with. And if you stop to think about it, why would I care about the biomechanics of where I saddle a bantha or a horse or a dog? Those are all things that the artists think about when they're creating creatures, especially if they have to interact with humans.
Yeah. And I always notice it myself. You know, certain ones have saddles that they put on, right? In the new Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon, they have they literally put saddles on their dragons, you know, and I just thought that was a really funny little addition. So I certainly noticed it with these bat, dog, wolf, whatever, you know, combinations. Because I really did notice something about their ears and about their sort of faces look very bat-like.
They definitely gave them some dog-like behaviors, which made them charming characters. And of all animals in the world out there, all domesticated animals out there, dogs mess with our brains and our hormones more than any other. There's actual scientific studies out there about this, about how they cause human beings to release a hormone called oxytocin. It literally makes us want to do what they want us to do. I'm not kidding.
They can hack us.
Definitely anecdotal in my household. That is true. So I'm going to have to go find the science. That's great.
I can tell you that when I go watch a film and I see creatures, whether they're supposed to be realistic or cartoony or even mythical, my sons say to me, "Oh, God, shut up." And so we have a deal. The first time I watch a film, I say nothing. And I don't start to think about or talk about my assessment of any of those things until the second watch.
I want to make sure we cover Purrgil because I have a soft spot for them. I started watching Rebels specifically because I heard more about these space whale squid things, and now they're in live action on Ahsoka. So I'm curious what you see there, this sort of, because we did get a couple more insights that we didn't get. I wrote an article, actually, one of the articles I wrote for Star Wars Insider had stuff about Purrgil, and we knew before that, yeah, they bioluminesce, they can travel at hyperspeed, they feed off of this like gas or something like that. But we got more in Ahsoka. We see that they're like baleen, just like baleen whales.
Definitely, these are whale-like creatures, and I was very pleased to see the baleen-like structures as well, which says to me that they're filter feeders. Whatever they're filtering out of interstellar hyperspace, I don't know. But of course, the back ends are multi-limbed, sort of inspired by squid or octopi. And boy, I got to tell you, I studied vertebrates, backboned animals, but things with limbs that don't have bones in them, that is crazy cool biology. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing to me was that most of the time when you see squid-like or octopus-like creatures, they sort of do this kind of motion where they're pushing by compression. But these animals actually have a sort of an undulation to them, which is a combination, really. And so they are a bit more inspired by the tail motion of a whale or a porpoise. And so one of the things they do, and this is in part because I'm sure that the artistic decisions were to give them that feeling of motion. You do see their heads bob up and down quite a bit. Now, in the ocean, that probably wouldn't happen. Okay, the most of the motion would be at the tail, but they're in space, right? And so the relative viscosity much lower, presumably, so that wouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Bioluminescence in lots of organisms is a way to either see your mates in the dark. Lots of deep water animals do this, or it's a means of communication, or both. Some bioluminescent animals have very, very specific flashing sequences that mean different things. It's literally as language. If we had an opportunity to study the natural history of these animals, I would love to see if there was any pattern to the flashing. Because, with the artists that do this, some of these guys are nerdier than us. The kind of Easter eggs they put into things, you never know if maybe someone said, yeah, we're going to make them flash, but let's make them flash something.
Right.
Or maybe it's simply a way, just like fishes can feel where one another are in the water. This is their way of seeing where they are in hyperspace so they don't bump into each other. Because if you're traveling at hyperspace speeds, you probably don't want to bump into anything.
When they go to hyperspace, when we see them in Rebels, they do flash in a particular pattern as they lay out their tentacles. So it could be like, hey, this is the alert to say, we're all getting ready to jump. Let's get our timing down.
Yeah, the other thing that I really thought of that was, for me, noteworthy, I mean, it's a cool look in Ahsoka, too, but it seems like that whole ring around the planet in this other galaxy is made up of Purrgil bones, right? They talk about this being sort of where they go in their graveyard. But back when, to me, they were half whale, half squid, the question was, do they even have bones? Would they have a skeleton? And so it at least gets answered. They have ribs, right? We see rib bones and jaw bones and those sorts of things. But
the whale part presumably could. The squid part might not need it. And in fact, things that are that flexible often don't have an internal skeleton, like our tongues. There's no bone in there, and it's extraordinarily dexterous. So perhaps not.
Wow.
So what in biology we refer to as a muscular hydrostat. Its movement is based on pressurization of fluid.
Oh, okay.
Interesting that you could do that. And this works when the pressure outside is less than the pressure inside. So you can control it. Well, the pressure in space is going to be less than inside, that's for sure. So I would imagine that those squid-like tentacles are fluid-filled and muscularly based.
Cool.
We see the whales, they have their eyes on the side and not facing forward. So, they're probably more on the prey side of things rather than the predator.
The largest of the whales, the baleen whales, aren't chasing their prey down. They're pretty much swimming through it. Mm-hmm. And that's what the baleen helps them do. It helps them trap the prey relative to the water that they eject. And so they're not like chasing after one small individual thing. But if you're talking about, say, a cat or a dog or a cheetah or a hyena, they're trying to track their prey in three-dimensional space. So they need depth perception.
Well, let's ask you our last couple questions, which is, do you have a favorite Star Wars character?
My favorite Star Wars character, everybody always said Darth Vader, right? Because bad guys are always more interesting. And small story, one of my high school buddies' mother worked for ILM back when they were in Van Nuys, California. She built Chewie.
Whoa.
Hair by hair.
Wow.
And on the weekends, she would bring home Darth Vader's helmet for us to play with. You can't see out of that thing to save your life. So I always liked Darth because I got to pretend I was Darth. But when it comes to the animals, I always liked, actually, believe it or not, the little ones, because the little ones were the ones that you could go crazy with. I always had I would criticize that maybe the tauntaun didn't move right or whatever. But when I saw those little weird little things bouncing around in the repair yard and the Mandalorian, I'm like, yeah, I like those things. I forgot their names.
Yeah. Those are the Womp Rats.
Yeah, I like those kinds of things. I can criticize a lot of things, but my good fortune is that having gotten to work with some of these artists, I know how hard it is to realize them.
Right.
And I also know that there are artistic decisions that are made. But yeah, just like dinosaurs, I like the weird little ones, so they're fun.
Yeah, well, and I hope that this show does that fine line too of we're not criticizing, but we are going to take a deep dive into these things and talk about.
We're not making documentaries here, but we're helping to bring a new level of appreciation, I hope.
What place would you want to go to study ancient Star Wars life? Where you might find specimens, or what species might you want to investigate?
Okay, here's the knee-jerk paleontologist reaction. Desert planets are hard to live on, but they're easier to find stuff on. Because when you're on a jungle planet, it's covered with plants.
Right.
Paleontology is hard to do in jungles. It can be done, but you got to dig a lot of holes. Whereas if you have enough water and enough protective equipment, you can walk across a desert and see stuff. At least places where there is some opportunity to see the dirt. That's where I would want to go. But as a biologist who's fascinated with the natural history of creatures, that's another story. Okay, that's when the jungle-like planets become more interesting. Like when we first go see Yoda, like, what was that thing in the water, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and obviously the diversity is something that must be explored.
Absolutely. Well, if someone is interested in becoming a paleontologist, or a paleontologist that gets to, consult on movies, what would you recommend?
Well, first of all, most people who study paleontology either follow a biological or a geological sort of course of study. But for those people who are interested and want to see if this is for them, one of the best things that you can do is volunteer at your local museum. Now, I live in Southern California, east of Los Angeles, and I have very close colleagues who got their start picking through fossils and helping clean fossils at the La Brea tar pits. In fact, one of my close colleagues at DreamWorks Animation is a volunteer at the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History. And man, that dude knows about dinosaurs like crazy. He's actually now had the opportunity to model and animate some. So he's found a way to combine his worlds. So museums are a great place, not just to visit, but to volunteer. And that's a great way to start. If you're in school and there happens to be a paleontologist who works there, he or she are probably teaching human anatomy and physiology. Look us up. We love talking to other nerds. It's what we live for.
That's great advice. Is there anywhere on social media we can find you?
I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter or X or whatever you call it. I don't post or tweet a lot. I do in my Twitter feed. I do, and it's just it's Stuart Sumida. I do actually tweet out all sorts of activities of our society. The Society of Vertebrate Paleontology is the largest group of paleontologists in the world. I'm currently the vice president. I'll be president next year. And I'm always tweeting out information about our annual meetings, our publications.
I hear that the vertebrate paleontologists are the most courageous because they show the most backbone.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. You know what they say about puns? Puns are like snakes. They're so low, they're right on the ground. Well spotted, James.
It's because I've been spying on you.
Oh my gosh.
That was a good one, actually. Pun is very divisive. You either love it or you hate it.
Or both.
Well, this is an awesome conversation. Obviously, there's lots more topics to cover, and we will continue to have Stuart hopefully on our panels going forwards. In fact, Stuart will be on a panel that I am running at Los Angeles Comic Con coming up. The panel is called Science Advisors in Science Fiction. And Stuart's going to join me to talk about How to Train Your Dragon, Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, and share some more of his paleontological insights. We're also going to have a registered nurse who works on 911 Lone Star, physicist who's worked in the MCU, as well as Stuart's wife who worked with him on some of the Disney projects, and then also a stem cell scientist who works on book series. I'll be moderating that at LA Comic-Con. That panel is Sunday, December 3rd at 1 p.m. in room 303A and B. I'll also be running a panel called The Science of Ahsoka. That is on Saturday at 6 p.m. in room 306AB. And James will be joining for that, as well as some other Star Warsologies favorites like Lisa Will, Sam Wins, and others to talk about all the cool stuff we saw in that magical series, Ahsoka. So we hope you'll come to LA Comic-Con and join us Saturday and Sunday, December 2nd and 3rd of 2023. Hope to see you there, but if you can't make it, we will have those panels as episodes for you within a couple of weeks after the convention. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us on the episode and also for joining us at LA Comic-Con coming up.
Well, I have to tell you that it's really, really fun to get to sort of bring a biologist perspective, paleontologist perspective to this. Yeah. I am possibly one of the luckiest people in the world that I get to do paleontology and work with animators and visual effects artists. Oh my gosh, how lucky am I? And my family puts up with me even though. It's super fun for me. And as a lifelong sci-fi fan, not just for things I've worked on, but I mean, I grew up with Bradbury and Asimov. Now I live for The Expanse and Star Trek and Star Wars. Just getting to talk about stuff like this with you, super fun. It is a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much for joining us and geeking out with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me. This has been a great, great time.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for being here, Stuart. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Stuart Sumida, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you're looking for the links we talked about, like the wildlife documentaries and other articles and stuff like that, that is all in our show notes page on skywalkingthrough-neverland.com/star-warsologies.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on the service formerly known as Twitter and on Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. Come join us and chat with your fellow listeners. It's the Star Warsologies podcast fan group.
Yes, and please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service. That really helps the word get out about this podcast. And if you share it with your friends in a group chat or on your social media, that would be great too.
No topic is off limits, even whether holocrons are called such, because they are hollow inside.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Max FX podcast, Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. And there's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies. For those animals that came out on land and stayed there, did they eat a paleo diet?
Well, sort of. See,
You don't
now
have
the
to
whole
answer
paleo
this
diet
question.
thing is quite amusing to me.